to our week in review this morning.
Thank you.
So let's begin with the events that took place yesterday. That's very fresh in our minds as public participation on the election law amendments came to a close. We saw the Joint Select Parliamentary Committee sitting late into the night to listen to submissions by the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. Before we get to the submissions, perhaps to you, Dr. Mwiru, what do you make of the 4 days of submissions that Kenyans have been giving their thoughts? Very mixed reactions. What do you make of that?
I think it's a good, process, and it is keeping with the constitutional principle of public participation. And so, in a grievous matter like the one that is before us, which is the amendment of existing electoral laws, I think it provided the wananchi with an opportunity to air their views and try and influence the final bill that would be debated in Parliament, and ultimately the law.
I mean, we've had a lot of that, Dr. Tumbo, but there's also been contention as to the scope of public participation, how far it goes, what criteria is used into ensuring who participates in public participation. Were you satisfied with this process?
First of all, thank you for having me in the studio. First of all, in response to that question, I want to echo my colleague's statement that it was a good thing. Now, it's difficult to criticize the scope at the moment because the window available for getting it done is very, very narrow. So what is missing or what is unclear is that there is no clear framework of spelling out to what extent public participation reflects what is spelled out in the Constitution. So without that framework, anything that looks like members of the public have provided an input into the process appears to be acceptable. But in this particular case, in my view, it was difficult to get room to maneuver to do anything else. And in this particular case, I think that individuals, in their own wisdom, who felt like they had something to contribute, were the ones who went forth. Individuals, groups, and interests wanted to make a contribution. They went there. But until we have that framework, for the time being, we would have to consider there has been substantial
public participation as provided for in the Constitution.
I wanted to say that, making the decision whether to go to Parliament to make a contribution of this kind is a voluntary act. It is very closely linked to political speech, basically the idea that you are free as a Kenyan to express yourself. So it is actually a mark of our political development if Kenyans, individual Kenyans, are volunteering to go and influence the kind of laws that are going to be governing them. So in that case, I think it's a good thing. And bear in mind that we shouldn't always be slaves of methodology, because we can all, it's not that, whenever these, invitations are made, people should go to Parliament and present themselves in person. They can always, deliver their document, and that will be acceptable as much as a physical, presentation, face-to-face presentation.
Of course. Go ahead.
So basically, that's the point I wanted to make.
All right. So, of course, one of the most anticipated submissions was by the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, which has largely been touched on even by the proposed amendments, that are being debated on currently. And so we saw that happening yesterday. But let's take a look at the process, or, the events as took place. Initially, Wafula Chebukati went before the commission earlier on, but we saw the commission having to sit again later from about 9:30 p.m. PM. And the bone of contention there is that he showed up before the select committee on his own. And they took issue with that, feeling that he may be there to express only his views and not those of the entire commission. So come 9:30 p.m., we see Chebukati coming up with the rest of the commissioners. But interesting is that the cover letter that he presented with the documents is said to have been inconsistent with the rest of the documents that were being proposed by the rest of the commissioners. We've also seen on the Standard this morning an inside source from the commission saying that that was the reason that why the commissioners refused to accompany him the first time. Let's get your thoughts on this, Professor Oweri Tumbo, considering that the IEBC has been fronting a very unified commission, a very unified team since their retreat in Naivasha about a month ago.
This one is a difficult one. The reason being that when you look at that commission, it has divisions in its ranks based on 2 or 3 different reasons. One is political alliance, which is not necessarily ideological alliance. The other one is a feeling that a lot of or some sections of that commission, there are people there who basically, whose backgrounds, all right, don't provide the skills and knowledge to serve on that commission. So there are people in that commission that are qualified, some of them extremely qualified to hold that position. Then there are others who are basically passengers who have arrived there through the political network. As a result, there is considerable discordance in the thinking, in the practice, in the methodology, in the political alignment. Right. So the discordance between different commissioners has created an impression that when they say they are united, it is posturing. It is trying to postpone, like we do in a lot of things, postpone the inevitable, whereby you know something is not right, but instead of putting your teeth into it and solving it, we tend to massage it until it explodes. This is a particular case whereby the public expectation is that IBC, among themselves, should be having a situation whereby they don't have irreconcilable differences. They should be able to, sticking to a particular line of operating, we should be based on a principle that in search of a free, fair, and a credible election, let's look at the necessities, the things that must be done, and then there are things that may be done, and then there are things that should not be done.
Right.
Now, once they have agreed on those, then they must look at it this way. How does this impact on our national health, on our national welfare? My view is that very common, when people are having difference of opinion, they behave like they're in their private kitchens. Right. When in fact, they don't realize that they are playing on the national stage for the benefit of the taxpayer. And this is what, in my view, if you asked me, I would appeal to them that irrespective of how hard they feel personally, or irrespective of how hard they are being pushed by the respective groups, the interesting thing is that they must obey the law. Right. 2, I mean the Constitution to start with, then the applicable laws, and then they must first and finally take care that what they are doing takes care of the public interest.
Let's focus, first of all, Dr. Mwiru, on these amendment laws, because they have the potential to really overhaul the entire electoral process. And so in these submissions, we saw a majority of the commissioners actually agree with about 6 of the laws proposed by Jubilee, only disagreeing with about 2, but the chairperson seems to be in disagreement with most of the laws. So again, a big discordant, a big division there we're seeing within the commission. What does that mean for the commission's preparedness and unity in leading this very important exercise for the country?
Thank you very much, Michelle, for that question. I think it is linked to the question that Prof has just answered, and I would like to tackle it in this way. To say that the IEBC is a constitutional body, and moreover, it is an independent constitutional body. And what that basically entails is that it is formed using the principle of delegation. Basically, Parliament feels that it cannot be able to live, because of the importance of the function of administering elections, it cannot be able to leave such an important function to, just anybody to do it. So administratively, that particular function is given to the IEBC. So what does that mean? It means that the IEBC has to meet in a plenary session and debate, its particular rules and policies, because it has the power to make policy. And that is policies that cannot be made by an individual. So in other words, an individual from the IEBC cannot be synonymous with the institution of the IEBC. And that is why you saw that the chairman was being turned away, because as far as the parliamentary committee was concerned, this was an individual who, although he is the chairman of the IEBC, is not a substitute or synonymous with the IEBC. So they wanted a corporate view of the IEBC, and that is what they eventually got in the end. Right. So in terms of the laws that are now being proposed, you can see that although the laws were initially opposed by virtually a lot of voices, I think sobriety is prevailing ultimately, and you can see that even the IEBC itself is accepting that these laws need to be amended. And a part of the reason why this is happening is because the Supreme Court, in its majority judgment, in I think paragraph 400, between 400 and 402, basically said you cannot, if you bring a petition, or if a petition comes to this particular court with the same kinds of anomalies, you can be sure we are going to invalidate the election again. So the IEBC is also conscious of the need to make these amendments so that we don't end up where we are. Yeah.
And of course, we're seeing a lot of issue, although with the commissioners, in terms of replacing or watering down the qualifications for the chairperson, saying it's a highly complex process that needs a person with qualifications fit to be a judge of the Supreme Court. But let's take a look at the events as they happened. That was earlier yesterday when IEBC Chair Wafula Chebukati was turned away by the commission or the selector committee after he appeared before it alone. But did the MPs read too much from this, leaving the other commissioners behind? Take a look at what happened.
If the documents are not signed by the commission, then they cannot be admissible before this committee. But they can be admitted as Honorable Chebukati's memorandum.
The decision of the commission cannot be made by one person. As we can see, the chair is alone. Even the secretariat. In the absence of the commissioners, the CEO of the commission should be here with him or any other members of staff. So clearly, it shows that there is a problem.
The commissioners and the IBC staff are all aware that we have signed a memorandum which is with you. But if that's the direction which this committee wants to take, that we want the whole commission here, there's no problem. They can all come, so long as you'll get the time.
All right, so that was a reaction by members of parliament when he initially showed up alone. Professor Tumbo, do you think that the legislators may have taken too much of an issue with him appearing alone?
I do not think that they may have read too much. What I suspect happened is that they are aware of the fact that there are factions within the commission. So it was easy to understand that those fractions or those differences may have influenced his decision to appear on his own. At the same time, look at it from the perspective of the committee. Now, their duty is to make sure that they get an opinion that is supported by all members, all commissioners. Now, in this particular case, in my opinion, a very small thing of demonstrating goodwill by the chairman, by having these people around, would itself have been positive. So their omission clearly, signaled to the committee that are we seeing a continuation of that fractious establishment in IBC. That's part one. Part two, if you look at the committee, you need to look at the position that that committee, who are the members of that committee, all right? The majority members of that committee represent basically Jubilee interests. So, in their opinion, anything that might be incompatible with their interests would have damaged, all right, the availability of adequate evidence to consider when consolidating or including their views in the final bill.
Right.
Now, thirdly, there is an interesting thing that is that I like to observe. In this particular situation, I am just wondering why IBC is not making extra effort to try and present a practical working front between them. In other words, there are things that they cannot be expected to have absolute positions. They are all there, really. It is supposed to be a team. But as it appears now, it's just a group of individuals who are largely incompatible, but are hanging in there because they happen to be appointed.
Right, because I remember even one of the commissioners, in their written submissions, they were reading, and I remember the committee, they're saying, please read and expound, as to what you mean. And one of the commissioners, I read and said, all right, so after that, I have no comment on what I just read. And there was a big question as to why don't you have a comment? And he said there seems to be a bit of a problem in agreeing on this issue. So, Dr. Muiru, that being said, we're just about 19 days to the date set for the repeat presidential election. And IEBC, as it stands, says it is trying to ensure a free, fair and credible election. So we've seen Wafula Chebukati, the chairperson, also, other than those submissions, seeking clarification from the Supreme Court as to the Form 34B, which aggregate results from the polling stations. Moving to the court, saying it was not very clear as to what happens in this instance when a Form 34B is found to have had errors. Is he allowed to correct those errors or alter or edit those forms to make the right changes? And he's also asking which forms then, especially with the minor KI case, the Form 34A or Form 34B, does the final result lie in? Help us put a bit more context into this because these forms, have been discussed in large detail. So which one holds the final announcement?
Thank you for that question. You remember that the minor KI case, the court determined that the polling station is essentially the final station where the results of an election are supposed to be announced. And in that particular decision, the whole way of the way we have been reporting elections was overturned. And basically everybody was, we could even say that the election was devolved to that particular level.
Right.
So the important form at that particular location is Form 34A, which is filled at the polling station. And after the Form 34 is filled, it is then taken to the constituency polling station, where Form 34B is again filled in, and that is the form that comes to the National Tallying Center, which is again used to create Form 34C, which is the form from which the winner of the presidential election is announced. So because of what the Supreme Court said, and given what the Court of Appeal had said in a minor KI, basically sending the whole election announcement business to the polling station, there was, what one would describe as lack of clarity in, the function of the national returning officer for the, presidential election. And that is why Chebukati feels compelled to seek an opinion of the Supreme Court so that, there can be clarification in this particular matter, so that because we are headed to the election in a couple of days, this issue does not come up. He doesn't make an announcement which is going to be invalidated because he made it when it was supposed to have been made by the returning officers at the polling station.
Right.
So it is, I think it's a deliberate search for clarity, and I think it is a good thing in my view that we seek clarity in some of these things, so that it also helps the Supreme Court to reconsider its position. Remember that the Supreme Court is the highest court. There is no appellate option for any decision of the Supreme Court. So it basically means that this presents them with an opportunity to look at their own decision once again, not to review it because there's no application for review, but to look at it and, they might just say, they might just find something that is in there that they might want to make an announcement on.
On the same.
Yes.
All right. Now, Professor Howell, what was your interpretation of this?
Actually, I want to take a step back and say what my colleague, Dr. Mura, said is, he said earlier that we must not be held slave to process.
Right.
I am a big believer in process because process determines effectiveness, determines quality, determines outcome. And what he has just explained, in my view, suggests that process is important. In this particular case, my personal interpretation of what has gone on is this, that we seem to have difficulties with doing simple things correctly. What is so difficult about filling a form and passing on the information? What is it? Is there something in our psyche that entertains, all right, crookedness? In other words, this is such a simple process that why do you need a court to tell you how to do? It's like saying you put unga and the water together, you start it in a particular way, you get ugali.
But I mean, haven't we as a country been asking Wafula Chebukati to stomp his independence and ensure that this is a free, fair and credible election? Isn't this move an indication of a commission chairperson committed to ensuring everything is laid down bare for a free, fair and credible election?
In fact, Chebukati has emerged through the process as a fairly strong-minded person. He's reached a point when, by the way, if he carries out this election successfully, he'll become a reference point globally for correcting or handling a difficult situation and managing to hold a successful and generally acceptable election. Now, he has emerged as a person, and this is what is apparent in his appearance in Parliament. He is considering that the country will primarily hold him responsible, since it was him that the Supreme Court is at the apex of the organization. The country will hold him personally responsible and cooperatively responsible. So it is up to him to make an effort to reconcile with all these other people. But where reconciliation appears difficult, the normal practice in negotiation is you make a little step, you consolidate, a little step, you consolidate. He's been very successful in consolidating his personal contribution in the activities of the Commission. And his effort to seek assistance is an example of an open mind. One of the primary observations I have made about the membership of the Commission, you get the impression that a fairly almost 60% or 70% of that commission are people operating underground. You never see them anywhere, even in their discussions. Nobody comes out other than Akombe. You don't see anybody else who has anything remarkably different or remarkably uniting, making a contribution.
Right.
Which means in politics that they are probably serving an interest and they are not allowed to hold a view of their own that is not guided by software.
And let's take a short break. I'll come back to you, Dr. Mwiru, because I want to also discuss whether he moved to the Supreme Court for this clarification because they could not agree on the same within the commission. So let's take a short commercial break. It's now about 22 minutes to the top of the hour, the morning. The conversation on our weekend review continues in just a moment.